This is the final part of our lesson on urbanization and its relationship to consumption. And basically, we're going to try to tie it all together. And to do that, I want to look at the town of Chimbote in Peru. So, Chimbote is in the north central part of Peru, about 8 hours by car north of Lima, about 400 kilometers to 240 miles or so. Um, Chimbote has become famous in Peru as a center for fish meal production. Indeed, it is where the most fish meal plants were located, and it is where more fish was landed throughout most of the 1960s. Chimbote fishermen were landing more fish than any other port in the world, and in some years they outcaught the entire U.S. industrial fishing fleet. This was a city that underwent massive changes in the 1950s and the 1960s. This is the most famous picture of Chimbote, taken probably in the early 1950s. In it you can see a hotel next to a town square. The town square would be on the right. There's a long beach. People are presumably swimming. There's people in recreational sailcraft. It's clean and it is idyllic. Chimbote, however, in the years since this was taken, has not done too well if you're concerned about things like cleanliness and beach safety. This is a shot of the same area of Chimbote within the last 20 years or so. You can see that the beach is gone. The hotel would be just to the left of the picture. The waves lap at the city shore, and it is extremely polluted. This gentleman with the cart looks like he's dumping bricks right into the the coast rather than going to the garbage dump. Okay, so we want to think about how did Chimbote get this way, all right, and what's its relationship to consumption. So we were talking previously about the aquatic abundance off the coast of Peru, and within the very long coastline of Peru, there's nowhere that has more aquatic afflurescence than Chimbote. It is sort of the peak area. Beginning in the 1950s, Chimbote was home to over 34 fish meal plants at any one time. There were more than 400 boats moored off of its shores, and about 5,000 men, and yes, they were all men, worked on the fishing boats. There were several thousand more workers that worked in the factories. There were several canning operations in the 1950s and later in the 1970s that employed women, but within the fish meal industry itself, very few women worked. Almost no women ever went aboard. And if they did, they went aboard disguised as men in order to be romantic companions of like the fishboat captains. So Chimbote saw a massive investment. Companies from the United States like Cargill and Ralston Purina, as well as from Spain and from Peru itself, set up shop there. Very few of the people who operated these fish meal plants actually lived in Chimbote. They usually lived in Lima and ran things from afar. Chimbote was left to become an area of production. The fish meal operations demanded massive inputs of raw material of anchoveta. As you can see from the screen, the chart here shows the yearly catch for Peru. Within this, Chimbotes usually produce 40% of this catch, but you can see that in the years that this chart covers, which goes from 1966 through to 1974. In the first 5 years, Peruvian fishermen hauled in much more than 8 million metric tons of fish per year. Two caveats: the maximum sustainable yield, that is the amount of fish that Peruvian fishery scientists stated would be okay to extract without hurting the viability of the species, was always around 8 million tons. So for 5-6 years in a row, they outfished that maximum sustainable yield. We also have to consider the illegal catch that was undoubtedly part of this equation. Generally, 30% of fishing catches went unreported. So in a year like 1970, when the official total was more than 12 million metric tons of anchoveta, they probably fished closer to 15 million metric tons. Okay. So fishing was great until 1972, and in 1972 El Nino came, and scientists think that it's a combination of the El Nino reversal and the half decade of overfishing, extreme overfishing, that made the anchoveta not only scarce but also impossible to reproduce itself. And as a result, we see in 1972 a decline from 10 million metric tons in 71 to just over 4.5 million metric tons, down to 2 million metric tons in 1973, the absolute nadir of the fishing enterprise in Peru. For Chimbote, this was quite problematic, as the town went from being based around fishing to not having much of an economic sustaining force after this, but we'll get to that in a second. Okay, but in here we see the cycle of overfishing, the overcapitalization leading to overfishing, leading to ineffective government regulation, and then the collapse. Okay. So Chimbote, as I was saying, was home to over 30 fish meal factories. The fish meal factories were highly regulated. The fish meal industry, the fishing industry, was highly regulated, but those regulations were very ineffective. There were all sorts of regulations on how high a chimney should be for a plant. The higher a chimney, the more dispersed the smoke got. There were regulations about processing and reprocessing of the different liquids and solids that were produced during the fish meal production process, but none of these were ever put into place. As a result, the fish meal plants, a lot of them ended up being in the middle of residential neighborhoods. Other times they were put further to the south, away from the population, but the population quickly enveloped the factories. So you had a huge population of residents in the middle of these heavily polluting factories. And one fish meal plant pumps out the equivalent pollution to a city of 1 million people. Add to this, there was very little in the way of sewage in the city, and the sewage that was collected basically emptied into the bay without being treated. There was no sewage treatment plant for quite a long time. So this gray area on the screen was home to 150 million people, yet it was severely polluted. Right? So Chimbote became synonymous with not only the fishing industry, but also the pollution created by the fishing industry. The beach, once the pride of the citizenship, was gone. The factories pumped really horrific smelling smoke into the air. They would discharge the byproduct of the production process, sort of a mixture of fish scales and blood and oil, directly into the bay. And there was even a secondary industry of people that would go around and try to collect the fish oil that came um, off of the industry. We see a lot of social impacts with it as well. The fish meal industry was a great way to make a lot of money if you were an investor. The two people on the screen are two notable cases of Peruvian success stories. On the left is Luis Banquero Rossi, a son of Italian immigrants who lived the classic tale of being a self-made billionaire. He started off selling kerosene in the highlands to indigenous communities and turned his small fortune that he made doing that into becoming Peru's richest man. By the time of his death, he owned 100 fishing boats, 7 fish meal factories, 2 daily newspapers, a couple radio stations, and was involved in pretty much everything you could imagine. He was murdered sort of spectacularly on New Year's Day, 1972, and if you ever track me down on campus, I'll be glad to tell you that story. The other guy on the right is Guzman Aguirre. Guzman Aguirre migrated down from town in the tippy top of the Andes in the 1950s and became a cook on a boat, and took his wages from that job. Being a fisherman paid a lot of money. It was very dangerous work, but paid a lot of money. He did a series of investments and eventually ended up owning several boats and a fish meal producing factory, and became mayor of Chimbote in the 1990s and is remembered as the only decent mayor of Chimbote. So we have a couple examples of a new elite that emerged. Peru had traditionally been dominated by a well-entrenched elite oligarchy that had been in control of the country since the colonial period. The fish meal industry allows for new forces to come in, and people like Banquero and people like Guzman Aguirre, who did become a congressman at one point, are crucial features of that. But this is really the odd situation. This is not typical. Chimbote also suffered from rapid urbanization. As you can see in the series of 5 maps, the city's population and its housing grew quite rapidly. The areas in black are those areas where people ended up living. Basically, anywhere outside of 1940 was an area that people had to squat on. The land situation in Chimbote was confusing, to say the least. There was only 3 groups of people that could own land, either the state, the indigenous community, or in the area that is in black in 1940, that was area that could be owned by anyone. Outside of that black area in 1940, land belonged to the state or the indigenous community. So throughout the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, through to, well, perhaps even the 1990s, people had to occupy land illegally. They would take reed mats, like you can see in the bottom right-hand picture, and put up temporary housing, waiting for the state to either kick them off the land or to give them a land title. So the population grew from 4,000 people in 1940 to over 200,000 people by 1970. Today, the population is around 500,000 people. The culture that emerged in Chimbote was based around fishing, and the fishermen. The fishermen were, as I said earlier, paid quite well, but they had many avenues in which to spend their hard-earned wages. Chimbote became famous for having bars and for having brothels and for fishermen being paid the equivalent of thousands of dollars on a Saturday morning and being gone on a Sunday night. I'm not sure this is the story for all people in Chimbote, but it does make for a quite rollicking tale. Um, it doesn't help that the fishing companies paid their workers in bars, and that you give 20 and 25-year-old young men a lot of money to play with, and seemingly no stopping of that money, right? The fish was always going to be there, so people didn't really think about the future. So spending $1,000 on wine and women wasn't something to think twice about for a lot of these folks. And this is a mentality that we see in boom towns all over the place. We could probably head out to western North Dakota and talk to a lot of people that made tens of thousands of dollars a month in the oil boom in the early part of the 2010s, and don't have two nickels to rub together today, because money comes and money goes. Okay, so Chimbote is, in my opinion, a fascinating place, and again, track me down and we can talk for years and years about Chimbote. We'll talk more about it in an upcoming lecture as well. Okay, so how did the fish meal boom affect Chimbote then? I think it had a lot of impacts, right? Fish meal made people a lot of money. Not only did the fishermen get paid well, but the people that sold the fishermen and their family food made a lot of money. The industrialists made a lot of money. National politicians got a lot of tax revenue from fish meal. Indeed, fishing became the country's #1 export by 1970. And local politicians also got rich by taking bribes. The state needed the revenue that fish meal was bringing in. There was very little political will to challenge the fish meal industry, and the fish meal industry did a really great job pushing back against the state. The state often tried to raise taxes on them. They often tried to regulate the fishing industry, and they were able to use lobbyists and use their industry pressure group called the National Fishing Society to promote their interests in Congress, and then later with the revolutionary dictatorship that took power in 1968. The fish meal boom also helped the people of Peru, as Peru was undergoing a population boom after World War II. Particularly, there was a crisis in the highlands where families were growing, but there was never more land. So a lot of people were forced to migrate to cities to find work, and that work was found readily in this fish meal industry, particularly in Chimbote. People were concerned from the start of the fish meal industry from the 1950s about the smells being produced by the fishing industry, by the fish meal plants, but a lot of people were okay with it. For them, it was the smell of money. And then finally, we can look at how the state reacted, and usually, even though there were constant complaints about the smells and the impact of the fishing industry and the placement of the plants, it was easier to drown out the voices of protest than it was to alter the way things were going. Okay? So we see Chimbote as a case of urban environmental history. Right? The city's ecological wealth, right, spurred the boom. Thousands of people arrived over the course of the 1950s and 1960s, and even through the 1970s. After Chimbote declined, people still kept coming. The city couldn't handle the influx of people. There were no housing market available. There wasn't apartment buildings that put people in. People were forced to find any accommodations they could, and oftentimes this meant going out and claiming a plot of land and hoping that it would stick, hoping that the police wouldn't come and kick them off, or worse. Uh, you know, the development of the city became a major challenge for the Peruvian state. By the late 1960s, people were calling Chimbote a tragic city in the press and calling it uh, one of the largest slums in the country. We see pollution being a major part of the story in Chimbote as well. The residents were assaulted by pollution. There was very little done to stop it. It was only in the 1990s when people like Maria Elena Foronda, who was in the video that you saw, whose article you're reading for this lecture, and also was recently a congresswoman, she turned the problems of Chimbote into a social movement that worked to solve a lot of these issues. And that was one of her main causes in Congress, when she was a congresswoman. And then finally, there were problems with infrastructure, where the town's growth made it almost impossible for the city to provide basic services like sewage, water, electricity, telephones, to say the least, paved roads. The areas that did have those services were the areas where not only the elite lived, but also the longer standing areas of town. In fact, it would have been really difficult for them to extend sewage systems into some of the shanty towns that had developed, some of the informal settlements, because it would have been illegal to put, sewage lines into these illegal settlements. Okay. So we see all of the three factors of environmental history playing out in this one city. So how does that lead into consumption? So we can see that our desire to eat more fish, to eat more pigs, and to eat more chicken has an effect on a faraway place like Chimbote. Um, the fish meal industry in Chimbote developed because there was a market for fish meal. The market for fish meal developed because there was a place like Chimbote as well. I think we could look at both sides. And the residents of Chimbote have lived in precarious conditions due to this consumption, right? And a great deal of political weakness on their part, right? But a lot of times, as we're having a piece of sushi, we're not thinking about what's going on 4,000 miles away, and it might be an interesting thought to consider that. Okay, that's it for this lesson. Sorry this was so long, and I look forward to your discussion.